They lifted the baby at the auction block, but a Lakota warrior raised his hand first. The baby's cry rose above the noise of the auction yard, just as the auctioneer snatched the child from the mother's trembling arms and lifted him high for the crowd to see, his rough hand gripping the infant's blanket while the mother stumbled forward, begging and slipping in the dirt as men shouted numbers over her voice, each bid a blow heavier than any whip. The father, red-faced and unsteady from whiskey, shoved her back with a grunt and barked, "He ain't yours to keep," while the crowd pressed tighter, eager for spectacle rather than truth, and the mother's fingers clawed at the air as if she could pull her child back from hands that had already priced him like livestock. The auctioneer's voice boomed as he circled the block, holding the baby aloft so the bidders could inspect the small, terrified face, and when the mother collapsed to her knees, clutching the post for support, laughter rolled through the bystanders, their boots scraping the dust as they leaned in to enjoy her humiliation, not one of them daring to question why a child barely old enough to stand was being sold under the sheriff's indifferent gaze. The father kept shouting that she was worthless, that the boy deserved a stronger home, that he needed coin more than guilt, and as the mother sobbed soundlessly, her palms flat in the dirt, the crowd surged again, shouting bids that climbed higher with every second the baby dangled above her reach, his cries turning hoarse. Then, through the noise, a ripple of silence cut forward as a tall Lakota warrior stepped between two men at the edge of the crowd, his rawhide coat stirring in the dust, his expression carved in stone. He said nothing, yet the space around him shifted as if the ground recognized him, even if the people did not. Another man tried to raise his bid, yelling over the commotion, but the Lakota warrior simply lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, and the auctioneer's voice faltered, the father's shouting cracked, and even the sheriff glanced up as the yard quieted under the weight of a single gesture. The mother's tear-stricken face lifted, hope flickering like a candle in wind, while the warrior's hand remained raised not as a bid yet, but as a warning that the sale of a crying child was no longer going unchallenged. The auctioneer recovered quickly, slapping dust off his vest as he forced a grin wide enough to hide the tremor in his voice, and he hoisted the baby higher, as though the Lakota warrior's raised hand were nothing more than a nuisance, shouting, "That's a bid then! A fine, strong man for a fine, strong boy!" Even though the warrior hadn't spoken a word, and the crowd seized the moment to erupt again, throwing out new numbers with renewed aggression, eager to overwhelm the silent figure who dared interrupt their entertainment. The mother lunged forward, desperate to reach the auction block, but the father yanked her hair and dragged her backward until she fell hard against the dirt, her cry muffled by the jeers of the onlookers, some mocking her for fighting, others encouraging the father with cruel laughter that stung the air like sparks. A group of men shoved the Lakota warrior's shoulder as they pushed past him to get closer to the block, testing whether he'd move or react. But he didn't even turn his head. He simply lowered his hand, stepped forward once, and the men's smirks faltered, as if they had stepped too close to a cliff they hadn't noticed. The sheriff, sensing the tension building into something he didn't want responsibility for, barked at the auctioneer to hurry it along, tapping the butt of his rifle against his boot, as if the sound alone could restore the authority slipping through his grasp. But the auctioneer only shouted louder, determined to drown out the unease spreading through the crowd. The baby's cries grew sharper, more frantic, wailing for the mother who crawled toward the block again, only for the father to plant a boot on her skirt and pin her to the dirt, forcing her to watch as the auctioneer announced a new, higher bid from a man waving a rolled ledger in the air. Someone shouted that the Lakota should state his price or step aside. Another yelled that warriors had no place in civilized bidding, and a few in the back laughed nervously, not sure whom to side with now that the air felt charged, thick, expectant. The Lakota warrior's gaze swept the men still heckling him, not with anger, but with a calm that unsettled them more deeply than fury would have. And when his eyes met the mother's, still pinned, still reaching, still shaking, he inclined his head just enough for her to know he had not stepped into this crowd without purpose. The auctioneer puffed his chest and shouted for final bids, desperate to finish the sale before the tension snapped, unaware that the moment he raised the baby again, higher than before, the Lakota warrior shifted his weight forward, ready for whatever came next. The auctioneer swung the baby slightly to rile the bidders, pretending not to notice how the mother clawed at the ground to drag herself closer. But the crowd's noise had changed. Less confident now, less amused, because the Lakota warrior had stepped forward again. The movement small, yet precise, like a line being drawn across the dirt that no one wished to cross. A man near the front, flush with drink and pride, puffed out his chest and shouted, "If he wants the child, let him say it! Warriors don't get special rules here." And several others echoed him, eager to push the moment back into chaos. But the sheriff raised a hand to silence them, his eyes flicking uneasily between the warrior's stance and the rifle at his own side. The mother lifted her head, face streaked with dirt and tears, and when her gaze found the Lakota warrior again, she whispered something voiceless, a plea only he seemed able to see, because his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Nothing soft, only a deeper resolve settling in his eyes. The father, emboldened by the sheriff's hesitation, yanked the mother upright by her arm, shaking her hard enough to make the crowd gasp, shouting that she had no say in men's matters, that the child would be sold whether she lived or fainted at his feet. And when she cried out, several bystanders looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the brutality they had come to witness. The auctioneer, sensing that control was slipping, slammed his hand on the wooden post and barked, "Final bidding! Speak now or step aside!" But before he could lift the baby again, the Lakota warrior's hand rose a second time, higher than before, and the entire crowd fell silent as though the gesture itself carried weight heavier than any coin purse. A murmur spread through the bidders, some backing away, others whispering that warriors didn't raise hands unless they meant to act. And even the sheriff took a half-step back, uncertain whether enforcing the sale was worth provoking the quiet force standing before him. The father tried to bluster his way through the moment, shouting that no outsider would interfere in his decisions. But his voice cracked when the warrior's gaze met his, steady and unblinking, as if stripping away every excuse the man had tried to cloak himself with. For a heartbeat, the yard held still, the baby whimpering softly, the mother frozen in dread, the sheriff gripping his rifle, the crowd poised between cruelty and conscience. Until the auctioneer, voice trembling despite himself, asked the question everyone else feared to speak aloud. "Is that your bid?" The question hung in the air like a spark over dry brush, and though the Lakota warrior did not answer immediately, the crowd leaned back as if bracing for whatever truth his silence carried. The auctioneer, sweating now despite the cold, lifted the baby a little higher to force the moment forward, but his voice cracked when he barked, "State your price, warrior, or stand aside," because even he felt the shift pulsing through the yard. The mother tried to speak, but her voice broke under the strain, and the father jerked her backward again, snarling that the child was his to sell, that no warrior's stare would change what a man decides. And several men in the crowd nodded along, not out of conviction, but because cruelty echoed easier than courage. The sheriff stepped closer, attempting to regain authority by tapping his rifle against his boot, saying the sale had already gone too far to be complicated by outsiders. Yet his voice wavered when the warrior finally looked at him, the kind of look that measured a man's heart instead of his badge. The Lakota warrior took one more step forward, closing half the distance between himself and the auction block, and for the first time his presence felt directional, not merely observant. The crowd shifted with him, murmuring, uncertain whether they were watching the start of a fight or the end of one. The auctioneer, desperate to regain control, slammed his palm on the wooden post so hard the baby startled and began to wail again, and he shouted, "Last chance, warrior! Speak your bid, or the next man takes him!" A gambler near the back raised 2 fingers, calling out a number meant to provoke more than to purchase, and instantly 2 more men began shouting over him, eager to force past the tension that frightened them. But the warrior didn't even glance their way. Instead, he lifted his chin toward the mother, still pinned, still shaking, and something wordless passed between them, a recognition sharper than any spoken promise. The father, sensing his grip on the situation finally slipping, grabbed the mother by the shoulders and shook her violently, yelling at her to stop staring at that savage and remember her place. But the act backfired. Gasps rippled through the crowd, several women recoiling, even a few men muttering that this had gone too far. And then the Lakota warrior spoke, not loudly, not in anger, only with the steady clarity of a man who had already counted the cost before stepping forward. "I will not let you sell the child." The yard froze, breath held, and the sheriff's hand slid slowly toward his rifle as the entire crowd realized that the moment of bidding had just become a line of defiance. The sheriff's fingers tightened around the rifle, as if the warrior's quiet sentence had struck harder than any shouted threat, and the crowd reacted in a confused wave, some stepping back, others craning forward, all suddenly aware that this was no longer an auction, but a confrontation hanging by a single thread. The auctioneer, his bravado evaporating, clutched the baby closer to his chest and barked, "This is legal business! No one interferes with a lawful sale!" Though his voice wobbled when the Lakota warrior closed the final distance between them, stopping only when he stood a single step from the block, broad shoulders squared, posture steady enough to suggest he had made this stand before. The father shoved through the thinning ring of bystanders, shouting that the warrior had no say over his blood, that he could do whatever he pleased with what was his. But the words rang hollow now, each one exposing the man more than defending him. And even the gamblers who had been laughing minutes earlier avoided meeting his eye. The mother staggered upright, clutching the post for balance, and when the warrior glanced her way, something inside her steadied, as if her shaking body remembered that not everyone in this yard wanted her broken. The sheriff lifted his rifle halfway, not aiming, just displaying it like a warning, growling that no sale would be stopped by a stranger with opinions. But the warrior didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand once more, this time not as a bid, not as a gesture, but as a shield placed between a crying infant and the hands calling him merchandise. "Give the child back to his mother," he said, low and unshaken, and the auctioneer swallowed hard, torn between the sheriff's authority and the quiet resolve of the man standing before him. A tense hush swept the yard as the sheriff stepped forward, boots scraping the dirt, determination tightening his jaw. But before he could speak, the baby let out a piercing, breathless wail, a sound so raw it sliced through the moment, cracking the crowd's certainty. The mother reached out instinctively with both hands, desperate, pleading, and the warrior turned slightly, as though positioning himself to catch whatever violence might follow, making it unmistakably clear that the next action the sheriff chose would define the direction of this entire crowd. The auctioneer, voice trembling now, looked from the sheriff to the warrior, to the crying baby in his arms, realizing with dawning fear that the sail he thought he controlled was slipping into something far more dangerous than he'd bargained for. The sheriff finally shouldered his rifle fully, not pointing it yet, but lifting it enough to make the threat unmistakable, and the crowd lurched backward as if the weapon itself had pushed them, leaving a widening ring of dirt between the lawman and the Lakota warrior, who stood unmoving, his calm more unnerving than any display of force. "This sail is lawful," the sheriff growled, voice straining to stay firm, "and you will step aside." But the warrior didn't shift a muscle. He simply lowered his raised hand and placed it, slow and deliberate, on the edge of the auction block, as though anchoring the moment to solid ground. The father, sensing an opportunity, puffed up his chest and shouted that the sheriff should arrest the warrior for obstruction, but even he stepped behind the sheriff as he said it, unwilling to stand exposed against the man he mocked. The mother reached for the block again, her trembling fingers brushing the wood as she whispered her child's name. But the auctioneer jerked the baby away sharply, sending a horrified gasp through the onlookers, because for the first time, several in the crowd no longer saw entertainment, but danger spiraling out of control. A woman near the front snapped at the auctioneer that he should be ashamed. A ranch hand muttered that selling a baby wasn't God's work, and a few men lowered their bids entirely, suddenly unwilling to attach their names to a scene turning uglier by the minute. The sheriff barked for silence, rattled by the shift in the crowd, and he stepped closer to the warrior until only a breath of space separated them, hissing that no tribe would dictate law in his town. The warrior met his stare, unblinking, and said nothing. But his presence, steady as stone, pushed the sheriff into deeper anger, because nothing unsettles a man with a weapon like another man who doesn't fear it. The father lunged for the mother's arm again, perhaps to drag her away and end the spectacle, but this time the warrior turned his head sharply, eyes locking onto the man with a warning so clear the father froze mid-motion, his hand dropping uselessly to his side. Embarrassed, he spat at the warrior's feet, but even that act felt feeble, childish, swallowed quickly by the tension gripping the yard. The sheriff raised the rifle another inch, voice cracking as he ordered the auctioneer to continue the sale. But the auctioneer hesitated, sweat gathering at his brow, because completing a sale against a warrior who hadn't yet stepped back felt far more dangerous than refusing one. In that fragile pause, every pair of eyes fixed on the sheriff, waiting to see whether he would push the moment into violence, or whether the crowd, trembling at the edge of its conscience, would begin to pull away from him. The sheriff's jaw tightened as he realized the crowd wasn't standing with him anymore. Their boots shuffled back, their murmurs swelled with doubt, and every second of hesitation chipped away at the authority he had tried to swing like a weapon. "Do your job," the father hissed at him, grabbing the sheriff's sleeve with a desperation that exposed how quickly his bravado had rotted away. But the sheriff jerked free, glaring at the man whose cruelty had dragged him into a powder keg he was no longer sure he could control. The auctioneer clutched the baby tighter, his knuckles white around the blanket, and tried again to call for a final bid, but his voice cracked on the first word, drowned beneath the low rumble of unease spreading through the crowd. The mother stood at the edge of the block now, unsteady, wild-eyed, her dress torn, hands trembling, but she did not back away anymore. Something in the warrior's stillness had stitched a thread of courage back into her spine, and when the auctioneer stepped away from her reach, she followed, no longer crawling, no longer apologizing for wanting her child back. A gambler to the left shouted that the sheriff should arrest the warrior before things got worse. But even he took 2 steps backward as he said it, unwilling to be near the first spark if the scene caught fire. The father lunged again, this time reaching for the baby himself, as if he could snatch control back through sheer violence. But the auctioneer recoiled, shouting at him to stay back, terrified now of both men, the father whose rage was spilling loose, and the warrior whose calm exposed every man's guilt. The sheriff finally snapped, raising the rifle high and barking. "Enough! Step aside, or I swear—" But the warrior moved first, not forward, not with aggression, but shifting subtly so his body aligned perfectly between the sheriff and the mother, forming an unmistakable barrier that forced every man present to imagine the consequences of pushing past him. Gasps rippled outward. The mother stepped behind him without thinking, clutching the back of his coat as though the earth itself had offered her shelter. The sheriff hesitated, just long enough for doubt to glint in the crowd's eyes. And something important broke in that moment. A rancher near the front muttered, "This ain't right." Another whispered that a baby shouldn't be part of any sale. And a woman pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling as she watched the mother trembling behind a man who had no stake in this except his willingness to stand. The sheriff's authority wavered, the father's certainty collapsed, and the auctioneer's grip faltered, the baby slipping slightly in his hold as fear, not profit, finally controlled his shaking hands. The entire yard hovered on a single breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to choose what happened next. The breaking point came fast, faster than anyone in that yard expected, when the father lunged a final time, not for the baby this time, but for the mother. Fingers clawed, spit flying, rage blinding him to the crowd that had already turned. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to wrench a cry from her throat, and the yard exploded into shouts as she stumbled against the warrior's back, the terror in her voice slicing through every layer of the winter air. The sheriff raised his rifle as if he could force the world into obedience, but the warrior reacted first, stepping sideways and pushing the mother behind him while locking eyes with the father in a way that froze the man mid-breath. Then, the warrior knocked the father backward with a single forearm shove that sent him sprawling into the dust, the act so clean and controlled that even the sheriff lowered his gun an inch, startled by how quickly the balance of power shifted. The auctioneer panicked, clutching the baby to his chest, and backing toward the steps, shouting for someone, anyone, to help him. But the crowd no longer moved on his commands. They parted instead, creating a clear path straight to the warrior as murmurs rose. "Give the baby back." "This ain't lawful. The sheriff should have stopped this earlier." And a mother in the crowd whispered fiercely, "Let that woman hold her own child." The sheriff tried to bark orders, but his voice cracked under the weight of too many eyes judging him, and before he could regain control, the father scrambled up and charged again. Not at the warrior, but at the auctioneer holding the child, screaming that the baby was his property, and he'd decide who bought or bred or broke whatever he pleased. The words were so vile, so loud, so undeniable, that the entire yard recoiled. Even the sheriff froze, disgust flickering across his face as the father revealed more truth than any lawman could stomach. The auctioneer, terrified, tripped backward off the step, nearly dropping the baby as he fell. Gasps shot through the crowd, a woman screamed, and the warrior moved with the speed of instinct, diving forward and catching the baby before the blanket could hit the dirt. He rose in one smooth motion, the child held against his chest, his broad frame turning so every person watching saw exactly who now had the most defenseless life in his arms. The father started to rush again, but the warrior's stance stopped him cold. Feet planted, shoulders squared, jaw set, not threatening, but unwavering in a way that promised the father would break long before he did. And then something unexpected happened. The crowd shifted forward on instinct, not against the warrior, but against the father. forming a loose circle that pushed the violent man backward step by step, until he stood alone with no allies left, the truth of who he was exposed under winter daylight. The yard fell into a hush so complete that even the winter wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what the warrior would do, as he stood with the baby cradled against his chest and the mother clutching her torn sleeve, breath shaking, eyes fixed on her child as if afraid to blink. The sheriff, realizing too late how badly he'd misjudged the entire situation, stepped forward with the stiffness of a man trying to reclaim authority he no longer possessed. But before he could speak, an older woman from the crowd shouted, "Sheriff, you better let that mother have her baby, unless you want the whole town knowing you stood by a man who tried to sell his own blood." Her voice cracked through the air like a whip, and heads began to nod all around her, townsfolk murmuring agreement, the crowd gaining its own courage now that someone had given words to their anger. The father tried to shout them down, spitting insults at anyone he could see, but every ugly word he threw only made the crowd shift farther away from him and closer toward the warrior, as if their bodies instinctively understood who brought protection and who brought harm. The warrior didn't speak. He simply turned to the mother and lifted the baby in both hands, not to claim the child, but to return her. And the gesture rippled through the yard like a moral verdict written in daylight. When the mother took her baby, tears sliding silently down her face, the crowd exhaled as one. And something changed. Not just sympathy, but respect. A collective recognition that the warrior's restraint had carried more honor than any law enforced on that platform. The sheriff finally lowered his rifle completely and said, voice unsteady, "This sale's void. This ain't how justice works." It wasn't an apology, but it was a surrender. The auctioneer backed away, muttering excuses, and several townsfolk stepped between him and the family as if to block him from trying again. The father made one last desperate lunge, shouting that the child was still his to do with as he pleased. But before the warrior had to move, two ranchers grabbed the father's arms and held him fast. One growled, "Enough! There ain't a man here gonna let you near that baby again." The warrior glanced at the mother, waiting, always waiting for her to decide her next step, and when she nodded through trembling breaths, he stepped to her side, not touching her, but standing in a way that told the whole yard she would not face the world alone. A murmur rippled outward, a rare kind of Western applause, not cheers, but silence that acknowledged a justice stronger than the sheriff's badge. When the crowd finally dispersed, some shaking their heads at the father's cruelty, others stealing long looks at the silent warrior who had changed the whole direction of the day, the mother held her baby close and stood in the middle of the emptying yard, as though unsure what life she was supposed to step into, now that the one forced upon her had been shattered in front of everyone. The sheriff, humbled and slower in his movements, approached her with the uneasy caution of a man who knew he'd failed at the moment she needed him most, and he cleared his throat before saying, "Ma'am, you're free to go. There's no claim on you. Not anymore." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and the warrior watched her carefully, giving her the space to choose without pressure, without expectation, without anything that could resemble a debt between them. For a moment, she didn't move, just breathed in the cold morning air as if tasting it for the first time. Then she turned not toward the road that led back to the man who sold her, but toward the open stretch of land where the warrior had tied his horse. Her steps slow but steady, like someone learning the weight of freedom in real time. She paused halfway, glancing back, not at the sheriff, not at the townspeople now drifting away, but at the warrior who had stood between her and ruin, and her voice came out softer than the wind. Will you walk with us?" It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a promise. It was simply a woman choosing who she felt safe beside. The warrior inclined his head once, almost imperceptibly, as if accepting her choice without claiming it. Then he fell into step a short distance beside her, matching her pace, careful not to crowd her or reach for the child unless she asked. The baby made a small sound, nestling against her mother's shoulder, and the woman let out a shaky laugh, the first sound of life not shaped by fear. And the warrior allowed the faintest smile to crease his expression before turning his eyes toward the long road ahead. No one followed them. No one dared interrupt the quiet that settled around the three of them as they left the auction grounds behind, walking into a day that did not yet promise happiness, but finally allowed the possibility of it. And when they reached the split in the road, one path leading back toward the memories she refused to carry, the other leading anywhere she chose, the warrior stopped, waiting once more for her decision, and she stepped toward the future with her baby held close, the warrior silently matching her stride under the open western sky. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen a baby lifted on an auction block, would you have stepped forward? Tell us in the comments.